Today our speaker, our keynote speaker, is Patrick Atkinson from Bismarck, who is an American author, educator, and human rights activist. During the 80s, Mr. Atkinson worked in a war zone reconciliation and post-war reconstruction across several Central and South American nations. From 1989 through 1991, Mr. Atkinson spearheaded human trafficking issues in Southeast Asia, including government-sponsored search for disenfranchised Americans in Vietnam prior to the 1995 reestablishment of the United States-Vietnam diplomatic relations. In 1991, Mr. Atkinson returned to Central America, where he founded several charities, including the Atkinson Center for Human Dignity, the Institute for Trafficking, Exploiting, and Missing Persons, and the God's Child Project. And my family has personal experience with the God's Child Project because my parents actually went down early on to help construct some property down there, and my mother was one of the first individuals involved with Patrick in establishing the God's Child Project. So there's a little personal feeling to that for me. Mr. Atkinson is the author and co-author of several books, including the international selling Message for My Child and The Powerful You, and is subject to the biography The Dreammaker by Monica Hannan. He's been shot and knifed and wounded in a car bombing in El Salvador. He's also the adopting father of 9 boys and 8 girls, and the recipient of many national and international human rights awards, including the Guatemalan Congressional Medal of Honor and the knighthood from the Spanish Royal Order of St. James. And he's recently married, like 6 months ago or so, to his beautiful wife and longtime love, Julie. Patrick?
Thank you. Deep breath. One of the things Julie said was when you get up there, first thing you do is you take a deep breath, right? Thank you. Good morning, and I tremendously appreciate this opportunity. I'm actually quite humbled to be here, standing before you this morning. Mayor Schmitz and Pastor Carr, thank you for my invitation to be here. To talk in front of our guests and neighbors and family and friends. As many of you know, I'm from Bismarck, and I've had a home here for my entire life. I still do, right across the parking lot from where my mom lives. So, and that means that when I'm in town and I'm not home by 8 or 9 o'clock at night, she can call me and say, "Where are you?" That's the kind of love that we have here for our families in Bismarck and North Dakota. So I was honored when Pastor Carr asked me to give this morning's reflection. I also immediately wondered what I could possibly say that would add to this celebration of prayer. So I looked back at my 44-year vocation, which is still running. I probably have 20 years left in me. And I wondered how it all happened. And the answer, of course, as you said, is prayer. There are dozens of different types of prayers. There are prayers of discernment and prayers of solace. There are prayers of guidance and grace. We often pray for help and protection and to celebrate and give thanks. Personally, and I know she doesn't admit it, my wonderful wife, Julie, prays for mercy when it's my time to cook dinner. I have a personal favorite, and that is called sacred prayer. It's that deeply reflective pause that we give ourselves that grips the core of our soul and who we are. It takes us in. It's because of our faith in God Almighty that prayer is as natural as taking a breath. We wouldn't pray if we didn't have that faith in God. Yes, it's because of faith that we want to pray. Just like we want to talk to our best friend, our father, our mother, our partner for life. My understanding about this came when I was 13 years old. I was with a large group of friends. We were over in Apple Creek, right by the country club, and we were playing pirates, which meant that the two groups of kids got in canoes and we came towards each other. We had a steel bottom canoe. They had an aluminum canoe. Our goal was to sink the other canoe I was the smallest at that time, weighed about 70 pounds. And as they jumped out to sink the other team's canoe, my job was to row us away. Well, they did, and they sank the canoe and it started going down. I didn't know, though, that the rope that you use to tie the canoe to the shore had been wrapped around my ankle. So as the steel-bottom canoe went down, I went with it. My life jacket was holding me up. The canoe was taking me down. So I was being held underwater, just suspended, couldn't go up and get breath, couldn't go down and untie it. The witnesses from that day say I was underwater for about 7 minutes. That's a very long time. At 3 minutes, you go unconscious, if you can even make it that long. And at 5 minutes, you start to suffer irreversible brain damage. Something my mom blamed on my adolescence later on in life. And she said that explains a lot of your activities. But I was underwater for 7 minutes. And during those 7 minutes, I had the classical near-death, end-of-life experience that I really wish I had time to talk to you about, because it was the most powerful experience a person could possibly have. It was the gift of death. And the reason it was the gift of death is I knew it had changed my life forever when I came out of it, because it left me with absolute certainty of the existence of God and the existence of an afterlife. Sometimes people say, I'm a Christian, I believe, but I don't know. Yes, there is a thing as absolute certainty, and we've had it. When we're done with the breakfast and we get up and we walk out that door and you go through that doorway, you know you're going to step on a hallway. Or do you fear that maybe you're going to step off a 30-foot cliff and go into a dark abyss? No, you know with absolute certainty that you're going to step into a hallway. And just as certain as we are that we're here in Denver today having this talk, are we? Or are we possibly in Bismarck? And how certain are we that we are in Bismarck, North Dakota? And I'm going to venture a guess that we are 100% certain we are in Chick's Place at the University of Mary. It was that exact same certainty that I came out of that experience knowing of the existence of God and of the afterlife. Now, I feel sorry for Julie. We've been a couple for 5 years, close. Afterwards, she'll say, no, Pat, it was 4 years and 9 months. About 5 years. And when I travel, I have to stop and read every road marker. I want to see every museum. If it says something happened here, I want to get out of the car and feel it, because I have the mind that I want to know what happened and why. And so it was that exact same experience that throughout my teenage years, I was wondering, God, what happened to me? All of a sudden, prayer became real. It wasn't a childhood ritual. It was a conversation. It was a pleading. It was a begging for knowledge. What happened to me and why? I was praying for guidance, for clarity, because there are things I needed to know. In college, I volunteered for a crisis line over in Moorhead, Minnesota, that took in calls 24/7 from Bismarck, Mandan, Dickinson, Turtle Lake, Minneapolis, Milwaukee, from this entire upper region. And they were from boys and girls, teenagers and young adults, victims of sex abuse and incest and violence and drug and chemical inflicted homes. There were children, our boys and girls from local areas who were living on our streets, sleeping under our bridges, eating out of our garbage cans when nobody would see them. I came to recognize their voices, know their stories, and I prayed hundreds of prayers that somehow they would find their way to a good home if they couldn't go to their own. A lot of the kids, I'd say at the end of the talk, even though we weren't supposed to, I said, would you like to pray? Some people will say, children on the streets don't pray. They don't know God. Because if there was a God, how could a God let them suffer so? But my experience has been very different, whether it's on the streets of Minneapolis or Bismarck or Los Angeles, Bangkok, New Delhi, Bogota, Colombia, and the numerous other places I've worked. These children want to pray, and they pray daily. And the reason they pray is because it gives them strength and it gives them hope. They ask for comfort. They ask for understanding. And sometimes they ask for revenge. Quietly, and I've seen this so many times, quietly, they also pray that they might have a home and a father or a mother who will give them the love and the discipline and the structure that they have always secretly craved, because a child knows when they're being ignored and they don't want to die on the streets. They don't want to be left alone. They need that structure. After college, I went to work in New York City. I was at this time 3 years out of high school. I went to work in New York City. I was working with the runaways and child prostitutes and the street gangs because I went to find many of the boys and girls who I'd been talking to on the phone. My goal was to get them home. You know, I wanted to get them home because I had a personal relationship. They never knew my real name, but we were there. But the work was tough and the work was dangerous. And if you don't take care of yourself, if you don't fill the water behind the dam runs dry. And I found myself running dry because I was so young. I was from the wrong part of the country. I was too small. I was very green and wet behind the ears. I didn't know what I was doing except going into the streets to help them, which was enough, but still I was feeling exhausted. So a friend and I went into we started building a soup kitchen in the South Bronx. And we'd go up every day and we would build and we would work on this abandoned, burned out tenement. And we did this for months. So while working with the child prostitutes, street gangs, and runaways during the daytime, I'd take a subway to South Bronx at night and we would build it. And we felt we were doing God's work in a double dose. One day a group of street gang kids came in and they tore the place apart looking for money. And all we could do was stand back because we couldn't take them on. There was no phone yet in the place with this pre-cell phone. And they were looking for money and they tore it apart and then they left. And I just looked and I said, I can't do this anymore. And I said, God, if this is what you wanted me to do, how did this happen? And I went out the building, I went up the fire escape onto the roof of the tenement. And I said, what am I doing here? I can't do this anymore. I looked out over the South Bronx and the Manhattan skylines and I said, God, what do you want me to do? Where do you want me to go? If you're done with me, if this is a sign that my job's over, tell me so I can go home. That day, I actually expected to hear an answer. I really did. It was so intense. I expected to hear the manifestation of an answer. But I heard nothing, like I was shouting into a canyon and not even hearing an echo. And every law enforcement officer, every first responder has those moments where you just act on faith. What I didn't know was I was minutes away from experiencing God's divine sense of humor. When I climbed down the fire escape and walked back through that alley on a telephone pole, there was a poster from a group called Witness for Peace. And they were looking for volunteers to go into war-torn Central America and live in the villages where the Mayan Indians were being massacred. Their thought was that by having a foreign presence there, the Guatemalan or El Salvadorian national armies would be much less likely to come in and commit the massacre or war atrocities. Now you stand back and you think, who would think a telephone pole in an alley in the South Bronx would be the right place to recruit for that? But the second I saw it, I said, that's it. That's where I'm supposed to go. A few months later, I landed in Guatemala City's International Airport. The Civil War lasted from 1960 to 1996. 250,000 people were killed. Hundreds of thousands of people disappeared. It became a verb. Most of the violence was targeted at Mayan Indians. I didn't speak any Spanish, except for the life-saving words that I had learned over on Taco Bell on South 3rd Street. Burrito, taco, Coca-Cola. And yet I was assigned the second I got off the plane to be the executive director of a war orphanage and to lead a war zone recovery effort in the highlands of a staff of 150 nationals, none of whom really spoke much English. I was no longer praying, God, what do you want me to do now? Instead it was like, what am I doing here? Which is also a good prayer because we're begging for an answer. You've sent me here. What's my job? We have to have faith and patience and let it play out on God's term. My 6-month commitment turned into a 7-year mission across Central America, El Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua, under Luis Pastore's the Sandinista War, Colombia and Panama under Pablo Escobar and some of the other elements down there at that time. We tried to get people to lay down the weapons and stop the massacres and the war atrocities. When there was an incident, quite often we were the first notified. We'd load up a Willys Jeep to go out and drop off food, medicine, clothing, and anything else that we could. We then took the survivors to regional hospitals, and we collected the dead and the dead remains and buried those in graves that we could later secretly mark and map using hard fixtures such as rocks and hillsides, so that post-war forensics groups could go in and document what had happened for post-conflict war crime trials, which a number of which I think you've read about in the local and national papers. As numbing and difficult as this work was, I knew I could do it because I had an absolute belief that this is what God wanted me to do. Not just do good things, but God said, Pat, I need you to do something special. Do this. Ronald Reagan once said, we can't help everyone, but everyone can help someone. And even though I was collecting the remains of somebody or driving somebody into a local hospital, I was there present for that person at that moment. I'd prayed for strength, hope, comfort, and understanding, just like the street children prayed, and God responded to each of those in his own way and on his own terms. I'm proud to say I never prayed for revenge. I didn't have time. It was just too busy. I'm going to do a time check here. Okay. Just before I turned 25, this all happened before I was 25. Before I turned 25, my work expanded into El Salvador. I was working with the Archbishop to set up and run a secure refugee center for the survivors of that nation's civil war. One night a car bomb went off in front of the hotel I stayed at. It tossed me onto the floor and it shattered all of the windows. It embedded in me shrapnel that later I had to have removed from my body right here in St. Alexis Hospital in Bismarck. A few minutes later, as I'm standing up going like, which way is right and left and up and down, an El Salvadorian A-37 Dragonfly jet bomber came over the top. I want to say about 3 feet above the top of the hotel. It was probably higher, but came screaming overhead as they were chasing a rebel column out of San Salvador City and into the surrounding volcanoes. Well, that was interesting, I thought, as I got my hearing back. And then another came and another came and another came. And I said, I'm not going to sleep tonight. I reached into the mini fridge, took out as many beverages as I could, and sat on the balcony and for the rest of the night watched those A-37 jet fighters fly over the top. Once again, I was asking God, what am I doing here? This is insane. This is madness. As soon as I asked that question in prayer, I felt this calming. The anxiety and the fear I had went away, and I just knew I was in the right place at the time. So what do? You make it through that night. The next morning, you go back to work. And that's what I did. Those beverages, by the way, tasted awfully good that night. My time in Central America came to an end in 1989. I was just about to turn 30. And as much as I tried, I just couldn't do the work anymore. I couldn't sleep at night. Images of the work we were doing in the villages kept burning through my mind and haunting my dreams. If I'd hear firecrackers, suddenly my chest would tighten up and I couldn't breathe. Carr, this happened on Avenue B and First Street here in Bismarck. I was walking down the street with a friend right by where we lived at the time, and a car came slowly driving down the street, and I could not breathe. It's like, what is that car? It was this absolute sheer panic. So I talked to Father Tom Kramer at Cathedral. I said, what do I do? Maybe I'm done. And he said, go on a walk, pray, and listen. That's what I did, and to my amazement, no, it wasn't my time to retire and come back home. I knew then that it was the right thing to do. A few weeks after that, I was contacted by a group of mixed government officials to research and document labor and sexual human trafficking in Southeast Asia. I accepted that job, and shortly after I arrived, I had dinner with the U.S. ambassador at his residence in Bangkok. And we had a beautiful dinner, great garden, and over dessert, he asked me about a side job I'd been asked to do to take on next door in Vietnam. This was 1989, and it was still illegal for American citizens to travel into Vietnam, but I learned there's always a way to do something. The country back then was still devastated by war and economic isolation. You turn on the faucet, brown water comes out, you throw a light switch, and maybe the light comes on and maybe it doesn't. My job was to go into Vietnam with the blessings of both governments and look around. Try and spot anything that could be a potential concern or a possible embarrassment to the political negotiators who were going to come about a year later. At night, I'd return to what was then the old Rex Hotel in Ho Chi Minh City, bathe in the brown water that came from the pipes, and then head down to the restaurant where a piece of cardboard was nailed to the wall with the night's menu. It always had one word on it: meat. Well, first day I was there, I said, well, what type of meat is it? And the waitress looked at me and said, it's meat. I said, do we have vegetables? And she said, we have meat. I said, okay, great, I'll have meat. Now, trust me when I say that for the rest of my time in pre-normalization Vietnam, I think I said every prayer I had learned since childhood every day, especially when I was being served meat. I was there for a while, and then all of a sudden I started getting letters from the kids in Guatemala that I'd worked with during the war zone, and they were saying, Patrick, come back. Come back. The program had changed, and it was a call from them that a number of them were on the streets, some of them were working as prostitutes, unfortunately, number of them had joined street gangs. I didn't know what to do because Southeast Asia and Singapore were about to boom, and I knew that if I wanted to go into the business world, I could benefit very lucratively, personally, financially, or I could continue to do the professional human trafficking work I was doing with increased responsibility and diplomatic access. And then I had, on the third hand, 1, 2, 3, I had the kids who had seen me as a father. So I went on long walks along the South China Sea, and I said, God, what do you want me to do? What do you want me to do? And you'll notice a trend here, and that's every key pivotal point. It's not what should I do, what's good for my career, it's what do you want me to do? A few days later, the answer came in the form of a letter from a boy I eventually adopted named Walter Luna, who wrote to me and he said, and I quote, Patrick, you were our father before, but now is when we need you the most. If you come back, Papa, we promise not to steal from you anymore. I came out and came back to Bismarck first. I took a job, we were just talking about this, at the North Dakota Highway Department for a couple months to clear my mind. We built the highway section up there by Mercer. My job was to stand there and hold a sign that said, stop, slow. Stop, slow. But it was looking at the flicker tails and the fox and the birds that really kind of helped me to settle down, because we have to fill that reservoir that's behind our dam. I had to recover from the village work during the war zones and the incredible intensity of the prostitution and child sexual exploitation in Southeast Asia. And met with Father Tom Kramer, Diane Schmitz, and I, the three of us. We sat together and we decided to start the God's Child Project. We thinking it was only going to last for a couple years. I would go into Central America, find the kids that we could find, get them in school, get them into foster homes, and wrap it up in a couple of years. The first year we had 37 children, many of whom I had to go into the street gangs, into the slums, into the violence areas, and buy them out of brothels or buy them out of street gangs so that they could escape without being killed. Otherwise, if they would have just left, they would have been hunted down and killed by the other gang members or the brothel owners. The second year we had 75. The third year we had 200. And from then it doubled every year for a number of years. Again, God telling us what to do instead of us telling him what we were going to do. Since then, your Bismarck-based God's Child Project has raised and educated over 80,000 children in Guatemala alone. In addition, we've started and ran health and school programs in 6 countries on 4 different continents. And this started here with Father Tom Kramer, Diane Schmitz, and myself. Why do we do what we do? It's very simple, because 2,000 years ago, Christ asked us to take literally his words when he said, feed the hungry, house the homeless, educate the undereducated, and care for the orphan and abandoned. We believe, and I say this publicly all the time, that we will have Christ's support if we continue to keep the program simple, regardless of how professionally complicated. We keep it simple, and we keep it based on prayer. I'm going to close here with just one story. We wrap it up. It's about prayer. One of the boys I adopted, he's living in Utah now, married, runs a very successful auto repair shop in Utah. He came and he lived with me, and he had a job about 20 miles away. And he would take the bus over and take the bus back and come back to the house. Well, one night I'm in Guatemala City, and it's raining cats and dogs, and I'm driving over back to our house, and I see this person sludging along in the rain and the cold, and as I'm driving by, I'm thinking, well, that looks like Julio Rene. Well, I get home, I keep driving. After all, he's going to come home in a bus, right? I come home, 10 o'clock at night, no Julio Rene. 12 o'clock at night, no Julio Rene. 2 o'clock at night, no Julio Rene. 3:30 in the morning, Julio Rene comes in, dripping wet. And I said, what happened? He said, well, the bus broke and we had to walk. There's no other buses at that time. But he said, Papa, you always talk to me about prayer and how it's affected you. And I prayed you'd drive by. I said, well, there's your problem. You should have been praying I stop. Be specific. God loves us. God loves what you do. Thank you for your time. I tremendously appreciate this honor. Thank you.